Alright, picture this. There's this one game you keep hearing universal praise for. You want to play it, but you just never got around to it for whatever reason. You keep hearing good things about it. If people can't shut up about how good it is, surely it's one of the greats, right? Eventually, you actually get around to playing it, and you think it was just alright. A good game, but felt overhyped and definitely not one of the best games ever made or anything. That's an example of what we would call overexposure. You know, a game that just gets way too much attention over everything else. While I'm mainly talking about video games in this video, this can apply to other forms of media like movies and books too. When something's really good, you naturally want to tell other people about it. Some people see it getting so much praise and try it for themselves, and they like it too. Eventually, it has this sort of domino effect where it gains this massive hype in the public mind and it makes it seem like the best thing ever. Before the internet, this was something that could definitely happen, but the internet amplifies the effects of overexposure, and you end up hearing way more praise than you would have without it. Because it's one thing when all your friends can't shut up over how good this one specific game is, but it's another thing when a bunch of random people you've never met are also singing praise through this one game. So when you hear nearly everyone praising Breath of the Wild, for example, there's going to be at least a few people who don't like it as much, or at all, and that's okay, no one's going to like everything. But this phenomena of overexposing games paints this set of expectations that a game can't often meet, and it's not even the game's fault, it's no one's fault really. We do this subconsciously. There's no way around it except assuming that every game is going to be terrible before playing it, which just isn't happening. The overhype paints an image in someone's mind of a game that's better than what it actually is. Even if you have no interest in this one particular game, you still subconsciously have that overhyped image in your head. There's no escaping overexposure. Explaining what this really is pretty difficult without specifics, so let me name a few of my own examples. This isn't an attack on any of these particular games, they just happen to be ones that didn't click with me despite their near universal praise. Pretty much every game being mentioned here is a good game, I'm mainly just using said game as a talking point. I love RPGs, so why don't I care that much for Final Fantasy? It's the series that most people first think of when RPGs come to mind, and yet they somehow escaped me for a long time. When I somehow ended up winning a Vita in a raffle in like 7th grade, and then PS1 games eventually making their way to the system, I figured I might as well give 7 a shot, seeing as it's probably the single most influential and beloved game in the genre. And honestly, I just lost interest soon after you leave Midgar. I don't know, the gameplay wasn't really clicking with me, the plot moved to a snail's pace afterwards, and I just wasn't enjoying myself enough to get to the end of the first disc. I did try it again a few years later, I think around 2016, and I did enjoy it more, but the same issues came up and dropped it after Aerith died. That's how well known this game is. You already knew about it before watching this. And if you didn't, congratulations. You somehow avoided the Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father of video games. Oh, I'm sorry, the game's like 23 years old. I actually ended up giving 15 a shot after I heard that people didn't like how it didn't feel like a Final Fantasy game, and I ended up really liking it. It's not amazing or anything, but it was this nice mix of Xenoblade and Kingdom Hearts that ended up being a really fun time for me. So much fun that it's actually the only game in the series that I ended up finishing. After getting an SNES Classic, I figured I'd try out 6. Out of the 3 Final Fantasies that I've played so far, this one's probably my favorite. People can't shut up about 6 either, so I know about a lot of the endgame stuff, but I liked how much faster paced it was than the others I've played. The battles are fast, the plot moves fast, so you never need to grind. It's just a fast-paced game for what I've played of it. And I really like how there isn't one definitive protagonist. Some characters are more important than others, but that just felt really unique to me. I really like how each character has their own gimmick too. Edgar had these tools that he could use, Sabin has you press button combos for his attacks, Taro could eventually turn into this magic thing. Gao jumps into the air and magically gains enemy attacks for some reason. Despite really liking it though, I still didn't end up finishing it, and I'm not sure why. In general, I think I wasn't overly impressed with Final Fantasy because other games took inspiration from it that already gave me similar experiences. It's like going back to play Super Mario Bros. It's still a good game, but so many other games use this as a basis to improve on that plenty of other games did the same thing better, not just later Mario games. Final Fantasy has some solid games, but not for me, I guess. Speaking of solid games, sometime last year I played through most of the Metal Gear Solids. I still need to finish 4 and play 5 for more than an hour or so, but that's beside the point. I wouldn't say they're some of my favorites or anything, but they are some great games. I was weirdly impressed by the first game because of his really good voice acting that felt out of place with the PS1 graphics. This era had a ton of bad voice acting, so it was really nice to see a game from this time with actually good voice acting to go with this story. There were a lot of points that made me go, man, they don't make games like this anymore. Like the part where you have to look at guards' asses to figure out which one walks like a girl, or having to put your controller into the second port to beat Psycho Mantis, or whatever the hell happens at the end of MGS2. So when I got to MGS3, I was excited to finally play this one. It's very commonly praised as the best in the series and one of the best games of all time, and you already know where this is going. It's still a game that I really liked, but it does a lot of stuff that I don't like. I'm probably just awful at stealth, but that lack of a radar really did hamper my enjoyment. And I get that the game takes place in the 60s, but I don't care. The survival mechanics felt unnecessary too. Having to worry about a stamina meter that decreases your accuracy and health is just dumb. The bosses felt overpraised too. I like how clunky the shooting controls were because it encourages stealth, but it makes bosses a pain in the ass to deal with. This goes for the whole series, but considering that these bosses were supposed to be the best ones in the series, I don't see what people like about them so much. There's still plenty that I liked though. I like the more cohesive story, and the stealth is fun when things actually go my way. And while fighting the end is still a pain in the ass, I love all the different ways that you can fight him. Like killing him when you see him earlier in the game, or just waiting a week of real time for him to die of old age. Again, MGS3 is still a game I really liked, but it ended up being my least favorite out of the Metal Gear games I've played so far. While something that didn't really affect me that much, Sonic CD is a great example of public perception worsening over time. It was released for the Sega CD add-on to the Genesis, which not many people own, so it ended up being that hidden gem in the series that no one really played. It did get a release in the Gems collection on GameCube and PS2, but people just ignored it, I guess? But it was the HD version that really changed people's perception of it. Because before this point, Sonic CD was the one game that was so good, Sega didn't want you to play it. The Sega CD, and by extension Sonic CD, were both rare and expensive. So I guess people had buyer's remorse or something, because they were saying this was one of the best games in the series. And people had that mindset going into the remaster, and over time, it was considered to be one of the worst in the series. At least before we get into Boom and 06 territory. Honestly, I'm pretty neutral on CD myself. I was never too big on classic Sonic, believe it or not, so I had pretty mild expectations when I ended up playing it. It's not bad or anything, but it's definitely the most forgettable out of the main Genesis games in my opinion. You probably get the point by now. When you hear so much praise about a game, it can subconsciously raise your expectations on it, and when it inevitably doesn't meet those expectations, you don't like it as much as you would have otherwise. I've often found that I like games with massive exposure hype around it better when I first played it before that hype was generated. Like how I played Breath of the Wild when it first came out and loved every second of it, but played Minecraft 2 or 3 years after it released, thought it was pretty neat and didn't play it much. So when I hear someone be disappointed from some big game like this, I kind of get it. It's just way more enjoyable to be surprised with a game that you haven't heard too much about, which is why the opposite can be true as well. Sometimes a game gets a lot more hate and criticism than the other games in the series, and it makes it seem like the bad one when it's about as good as the other games. It can happen for a lot of reasons. Maybe it does one thing worse than the other games, maybe it's just average compared to the rest of the series, but pretty good on its own, or maybe it just does something weird that doesn't strike a chord with fans. This makes sense too. When you don't like something, you tend to not want to talk about it beyond, man, this game sucks. Okay, some people aren't like that. They'd rather just complain about something they don't like, but in general, you don't want your friends to play games you think they wouldn't enjoy, so overhated games end up being underexposed, and that bad word of mouth lowers your opinion of it if you haven't played it. So when you end up taking the plunge anyway and enjoy yourself, you end up liking the game more than you would have otherwise because of how pleasantly surprised you were. Golden Sun Dark Dawn might just be the best example that I can think of. Golden Sun isn't exactly the most popular series around, but legitimate question to those who know about the GBA games but haven't played them. Did you know there was a DS game? Because I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't. Dark Dawn has plenty of issues, like an easier difficulty and various points of no return, but I fail to see how this is a bad game. I'm not really too sure what happened with this one. A lot of Golden Sun fans just seem to hate it for some reason, to the point where even they tell you to just skip Dark Dawn. Combine that with not selling well and not getting much attention, and you have a game that seemingly no one wants to talk about beyond its faults. Its issues are totally there, but it's a great game with likable characters and enjoyable gameplay. Because all I heard about Dark Dawn beforehand was that it was bad, I liked it more than I would have otherwise, since that wasn't how I felt after playing it. That was a more obscure case, though. Let's look at a game that you've probably heard about before. Remember when all I heard about Metal Gear Solid 3 was that it was amazing? Well, I mostly heard that Metal Gear Solid 2 wasn't very good, or at the very least the weakest in the main Solid series, which I kind of get. This game did this bait and switch promotional thing where they had you thinking that Snake was still the main protagonist, but was instead seemingly killed 2 or 3 hours in. And for the rest of the game, you play as this new character named Raiden. I get why people would be mad about this, but it's honestly pretty funny in hindsight and totally literally something that Hideo Kojima would do. I set my expectations low for this one, and I was surprised at how much more fun I was having over the first game. MGS2 did a lot to improve the gameplay over the first. You have a lot more options now, what with a trank gun and a first-person camera while aiming. Despite no longer playing as Snake, Raiden plays exactly the same. The gameplay is a direct improvement over the original, and despite a lot of people not liking Raiden nearly as much as Snake, I actually ended up liking Raiden more. I just love how much of a dork he is. Although his girlfriend Rose just kind of exists, I don't really know why she's there. The game does some weird as hell meta stuff near the end too. It's crazy how this game more or less predicted the impact of the internet on the world in like 2001, and the story was even written about 2 years earlier. I was under the impression that this was the weakest entry, and despite that, it ended up as my favorite in the series. Same with Dark Dawn as well. So yeah, when a game's underexposed and you don't hear much about it, your expectations are naturally lowered. You just don't expect much of something when you don't know anything about it. Of course, there's still a case of a game being overlooked like Dark Dawn, but if you decide to play it, the result can still be the same. Your low expectations made you like it a lot more than you would have otherwise. Obviously, this isn't always the case, just like with overexposure. A lot of the time, the reason why there's such a negative reception is because the game's bad. You don't hear the masses suddenly praising Sonic 06 because the only enjoyment you might get from that game is the novelty of playing a bad game. You know, it's so bad it's good. Also, the soundtrack does not deserve to be in the game that it's in. Underexposure isn't necessarily the same thing as something like a cult classic though, because with cult classics, people's opinion on the game are generally positive. It just didn't get as much attention as fans would have liked. In fact, they can end up being more in the overexposed category, depending on how loud its dedicated fans are. When I first played the likes of Earthbound and Okami, I felt underwhelmed because I'd heard so much about them despite their low initial sales that I just expected something more from them. Hence, overexposure. But these examples have mostly been my own experiences so far. Let's look at how two different levels of exposure affect two people's experience with the same game, with that game being Persona 5. If it wasn't obvious by how frequently I bring this series up, I love Persona. But 5 was my first Persona game, and I played it a few months after it first released in English. All I really knew about it was that it was really good. I like RPGs, so I figured I might like it. I wanted to play Persona 4 Golden when it came out on Vita, but never got around to it, so maybe I can make up for it with this. Besides, I just graduated high school at the time, so what better way to celebrate than a game about high school? Irony. And man, was I blown away. I love the style, the characters, and the RPG gameplay made it hard to put down. In hindsight, the story's got some issues, but on my first playthrough, I was loving it way too much to even notice. It's the longest game I've ever played, and I blasted through it in like 3 weeks. Over the course of the next few years, it sneaked its way into my top 10 favorites, which basically never happens for me. I later played 4 Golden and 3 Portable, and it turns out those games are fantastic too. When Royal came out, I even bought the Collector's Edition, which I haven't done since Skyward Sword. And even then, that was only because I didn't have a Wii Motion Plus, so I literally couldn't play the game unless I bought the Collector's Edition. But the point is, despite the fact that Royal was a game I mostly already played, I still managed to play it in like 3 or 4 weeks, but I probably should have been focusing on school. I genuinely don't know how I still got all A's and B's last semester. By all accounts, I probably should have failed my geology class. Like seriously, Persona 5 is phenomenal. I love it so much. But not everyone sees it that way. So let me introduce you to my friend Space King. Unless you've seen my Portal 2 review, in which case I've mentioned him before, but whatever. He loves RPGs too, honestly probably more than I do. We have pretty similar tastes in games, but we played Persona 5 with very different levels of exposure to it. He didn't have a PS4 in 2017, and by the time he did have one and got around to playing Persona 5, the whole game was practically spoiled for him. He had seen basically every major character at least once, he had a few plot points spoiled for him, including the pancake thing, and he couldn't stop hearing about how it was one of the best RPGs ever made. A very big contrast to how little I knew about it before playing. While it's still a game he likes, he just has too many story issues with it to love it. Plus, he doesn't really like the characters as much as the other games, and the whole changing people's hearts thing he didn't agree with. And again, for comparison, I didn't even know about that part of the game before I played it. He loves the gameplay, but considering how many cutscenes the game has, I get why that would bring someone's enjoyment down. So the incredible game he had heard so much about turned out to be not that great. But you remember my experience with Persona 5? That was his experience with Persona 4 Golden. Compared to 5, he had heard next to nothing about 4 4. He doesn't spend a whole lot of time at home and is mainly out doing other stuff, so full Golden 3 portable being on a handheld was more attractive than being tied down to a console. He would have played 3 first, but it seemed likely for remake territory, so he figured he'd skip it for the time being. Which is the story of how he bought a Vita in 2020 to play Persona 4 Golden and regretted it a few months later. But he loved it so much that he didn't care. Now it's one of his favorite games. As soon as that PC port was released, he just threw his money at Atlas. He was blown away. And with the pandemic happening and him spending more time at home, he figured it'd be a good time as any to play the other games in the series. Somewhat similar situation with 3. We have a Twitter friend that keeps saying Persona 3 is bad and was pretty happy to find out that Persona 3 is unsurprisingly not a bad game. I don't know what his issue is, to be honest. So while we've got people like me that loved Persona 5, you've also got people that didn't like it as much as they could have because of how many people kept talking about it. And loudly, I may add. Even if it's not Persona 5, I'm sure there's some popular hyped up game you've played that you didn't end up liking as much as everyone else. Or vice versa. Maybe you really like the game that everyone else likes to rag on, as well as there being some games that you liked as much as everyone else. That's totally normal. Everyone likes some things and don't like other things. Because this is just the varying experiences of two people playing the same game under different circumstances. Now imagine this kind of thing on a much bigger scale. If enough people end up having a different experience, the unpopular side continues to get louder until eventually, the popular opinion shifts to the other side, which makes sense when you really stop to think about it. If enough people play the same game, there's going to be some people who don't like it no matter how good it is. Your favorite game ever might be hated by someone else. Maybe all the water in Pokemon Emerald doesn't bother you, but someone else hates it and roots for Team Magma. Maybe all the well-made characters in Smash Ultimate makes you want to keep playing and try them all out, but maybe someone else hates that too many of them come from the same series. There's nothing really wrong with that. That's just what happens sometimes. You can't like everything. These kinds of different experiences can create a good-bad cycle of public opinion. It's extremely well received at first, but as more and more people have a bad experience with it, it slowly becomes a game generally perceived as bad. Think Minecraft. Back when it first entered beta in 2009, it was all over the place, even more so when it hit 1.0 in 2011. It was almost inescapable. Everyone was playing it. Everyone was talking about it. I don't remember when specifically, it must have been around 2014 or 2015 when I noticed people thinking the game was the cringiest thing ever. It was shoved down people's throats so much that most people were sick of it. It's hard to say why specifically since people stopped playing it for different reasons. Some people just got tired of it, others just moved on to something else, but a ton of people were just tired of seeing it everywhere. It didn't help that it's popular with kids that tend to make cringy things in the game because they're kids, but look at it now. It was this weird combination of people taking a long enough break from it, it being old enough for nostalgia to kick in, and it still being a well-made game being available on literally every console, including the freaking new 3DS, that made it have a resurgence in the last year or two. Minecraft is bigger now than it's ever been, transcending its indie beginnings to now be the best-selling game of all time. And yet, it's still something that you can avoid now. It's popular as hell for sure, but it's not like early 2010s YouTube where everyone was playing it. Plus, there's even more content than there was before, so even people who played it obsessively still have something new to experience in it. It's honestly pretty awesome that this resurgence happened, because I was one of those guys that thought it was cringy at one point. I think I was on a stream with Space King in like 2017, and I was like, God, why am I on a Minecraft stream? But my other friends streamed Minecraft in like 2019, and I was just like, hell yeah, dude, I'll play Minecraft with you. It's just really cool to see people enjoying a game that used to be the cool thing to hate. The opposite can be true, too. Games that were received poorly at first can end up being well-liked later on. Like, dude, Pokemon Black and White may be one of the most well-liked games now, but there were so many people that hated them when they first came out. Granted, a ton of people liked the games too, but the negative opinion was so much louder. A ton of people hated the Pokemon designs, and not being able to use your old favorites made the game unplayable to a lot of people without even giving the new ones a chance. As time went on, either people just got used to the unit of Pokemon, or they just stopped playing and forgot about Black and White, because the people who did like the game kept playing and talking about it. Zelda Wind Waker is another great example. It may be one of the highest regarded games in the series now, but back when it was first revealed, people hated it solely for the art style, and it took years for people to give the game an actual chance. I guess I get it. When you show this well-received, realistic tech demo for the next Zelda and then completely shift direction and make it cartoony, plenty of people can be upset. The industry was also shifting toward everything being edgier and more realistic around this time. People didn't want to play cartoony kids games, which is probably why the Twilight Princess reveal had the exact opposite response. Ironically, not a ton of people really talk about Twilight Princess anymore, despite it being considered one of the best games ever when it first came out. Sonic Colors is a similar situation, one of the most well-received games in the series when it first came out, but a ton of people don't seem to like it nowadays. And there's examples of games becoming very divisive over time instead of one way or the other. Like you've got people still loving Mario 64 as one of their favorite games, even going as far as reverse engineering the game to see how it works, and others who just think it's aged poorly and not enjoyable by today's standards. It's genuinely fascinating how public perception can change over time. Some people just end up seeing the flaws in a game over the years, and others just grow up not having played it and just like what they grew up with better. It's not really a sense of most people hating what they used to like over time. It's more so that new people experience the same game at different points in time and forming different opinions on it. When you're used to a game, you can put up with the quirks of it and don't mind them, but someone who's playing for the first time might not, and it makes a big impact of what they think of it. But at the same time, some newer players might not mind those quirks like the older players. Like someone nowadays might be put off by Quake's primitive graphics that honestly look kinda ugly, but someone else might enjoy it because it's still a fun game. Or maybe a newer Fire Emblem player might find it hard to get into the older games because of less quality of life stuff, but someone else might have played newer Fire Emblem enough to have just gotten used to how the game works and doesn't mind having to slowly make sure your units are out of danger or resetting because someone died. I don't like seeing these characters in pain, okay? Of course, there's still cases where overexposed, really hyped up games actually lived up to that hype. Like, I kept hearing that Chrono Trigger is one of the best RPGs ever made and is a timeless classic that will never age, and, yeah, it is. I heard Mega Man X was one of the best games in the series all the time, and when I eventually played it, it was pretty easy to come to that same conclusion. I wasn't crazy about Super Metroid at first, but the more I played it, the more engrossed in it I became. It just feels like one of the all-time greats, like what a ton of people kept saying. I had a pretty similar experience with Metroid Prime, actually, although Prime isn't one of my favorites like Super is. Mother 3 takes a lot more effort to get into because you need to install a ROM patch to play it in English, but damn if it ain't worth it. It's crazy how much emotion can be packed into GBA sprites, and the more serious and depressing narrative oddly fits with the colorful graphics and usual Earthbound quirkiness. Even when I knew what happens, that ending still hit like a truck, and to think this is supposed to be the light-hearted version of the game. Like, Jesus, how dark was Earthbound 64 supposed to be? It obviously depends on the person, but even stupidly hyped up, overexposed games can end up clicking with you despite the increased expectations. Just because this phenomena happens doesn't mean it always affects someone's enjoyment, just a very noticeable amount of times. Because your expectations really can play a big part in how much you end up enjoying a game. Think of the most disappointing game you've ever played. Were you disappointed because the game was something that you legitimately didn't enjoy, or was it because you had unrealistically high expectations for it? The most disappointing games I've ever played were Pokemon X and Y, Paper Mario Sticker Star, and Sly Cooper Thieves in Time. And after playing them years later, 2 of those were actually pretty solid games that I still enjoyed. The other is Sticker Star. To think that I played all 3 of those for the first time in the same year. In fact, I often end up enjoying games way more when I have zero expectations for them. Because in that same year, I played Fire Emblem Awakening, and it was one of my favorites for a long time. I had played Sacred Stones, and I wasn't really into it. I liked the general gameplay, but hated how characters died permanently, making your mistakes brutally punishing. Awakening let you turn that off, so I figured I'd give the series a second chance. I was thinking that I would like it, but not play it like 6 or 7 times like it. Similar deal with Paper Mario. I had never even heard of it until I found it on the Wii Shop channel and thought it looked cool. I ended up loving that game so much I got the 1,000-Year Door pretty much immediately after. There's this weird sense of wonder when you play a game completely blind. You don't know what it'll throw at you, you don't know where the story's going, you don't know how much you'll even like it by the end. But the only way to find out is to just keep playing. This is why I no longer watch Let's Plays of games I've never played but want to. I'd rather not rob myself of that blind experience if I can. It's much more enjoyable to form my own experiences and opinion instead of watching someone else experience it. It's obviously impossible to go into a game 100% blind nowadays. If it's a game you're interested in, you're likely to hear something about it because of social media. Most games you end up wanting to play will likely be that way because you heard something about it. Maybe the gameplay looks enjoyable, or the story or concept seems cool. You know, reasons to grow interested in playing a video game. You might not have even heard of some games if not for word of mouth. Just look at most indie games. Why else would I somehow be playing a game about terrorizing innocent civilians as a goose? Because that sounds hilarious. Overexposure can be seen as a necessary evil in that regard. We live in an age where information is everywhere and seemingly infinite. Finding random games you've never heard of is easier than ever, but it's when that same overexposure raises your expectations to unrealistic heights that it becomes obnoxious. It's partially why I don't get myself stupidly hyped for games anymore. What's the point in getting excited if that excitement just makes me not like it as much as I could have? Why spend so much energy waiting for things when I can just enjoy what I already have? Why watch someone else play it and rob experiencing it for myself? It's crazy how much I've enjoyed games when I just lowered my expectations. Don't go in thinking it'll be the best game ever made. See what it's about for yourself. Maybe you'll enjoy yourself, maybe you won't, and if you don't like it, stop playing. It's not for you. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't need to continue just to say you finished it. There's no point if you're not enjoying your time with it. Every now and then there's a game I can't help but get excited for. That's inevitable. New Zelda, new Metroid, new Smash characters, I can't not be looking forward to them. There's nothing wrong with having something to look forward to. It's the main reason why we keep on living. But maybe the game you're looking forward to isn't a new one coming out. Maybe it's an old game, even one that you've already played, one that you're currently playing. Look forward to the next time you play it. Try not to take that for granted. It's amazing. Hell, even replay some of your favorites and remember why you like the medium so much to begin with, because you already know how much you like what you've already experienced. People saying how much they've loved their experience with something is a beautiful thing, but don't let that take away your enjoyment. Go in level-headed. Be excited, but be realistic. Even if you don't like it, that's fine. That's your opinion. It's not something to be ashamed of. Just move on to something else. The older I get, the more I find myself not caring about what's coming in the future. Because above all else, video games are meant to be enjoyed, and while that enjoyment comes in a near limitless amount of forms, I enjoy them most when I'm actually playing them. There's something worth talking about, worth praising, worth criticizing, worth playing. Video games can be a guiding light that gets you through dark times, or they can make the good times even better. And to have that kind of experience taken away from me because I couldn't control my excitement feels tragic.